you all for joining us again today. So this next panel is titled From X to Z, Two Generations of Youth Activism. And today we're joined by two amazing speakers that I've had the pleasure to get to know throughout the past few months, and they are also speakers that have worked with JP before. So this panel will discuss each of their own experiences working inside the criminal justice system. So Dr. Jamie Batter and Hanna Dershowitz will kind of reflect on the criminal legal system and discuss about how it has changed just over the times and different and about that. I'll let both of them introduce themselves because they're amazing speakers, and we'll get into the panel now.
Hi, everybody.
And hi as well. Who's going to start, Jamie?
I'm happy to follow you. Also, my dog seems to be barking right now, so it might be a good time to mute myself for a couple minutes.
All right, I'll introduce myself. You all can read the bios, so I'll just talk a little bit about my perspectives on the topic. So I grew up in Brooklyn, New York in the 70s and 80s. And when I was in high school, the drug war was just getting really jacked up with military equipment and big federal money for prisons and drug enforcement efforts. And the rhetoric of lock 'em up was all you heard in the messaging about crime back then, kind of like what we're starting to hear again now. This was the period of the abandonment of the rehabilitative ideal, and the government decided to put all of its money into punishing its way out of crime. There were big political points in both parties if you talked about super predators or being tough on crime and seeking high sentences. Crack was everywhere. And we were just learning about AIDS. Apartheid was wreaking havoc in South Africa and the Black community. And my peers and I were worried about rollbacks of abortion rights and nuclear war, two things that are again in people's lexicon today. I was active in protesting apartheid and other issues, and I was strongly motivated to stop the unjust imprisonment of people for using drugs, especially a natural and relatively harmless one like marijuana. I knew the grownups were lying, and I knew that I wanted to work on that issue. And I did, even as a high school student. I was in YMCA's Youth and Government program, and I passed a youth bill to legalize marijuana in New York State, not a difficult thing. I mean, quite a difficult thing. But back then, marijuana legalization was a punchline. It wasn't a serious thing you could build a career on. So now you've got huge firms dedicated to cannabis law. Very different scene on that. So what did I do with all this intention that I had back in high school? Well, a lot of different things. I was a journalist for 6 years before I went to law school. I've done litigation, transactional law, represented individuals, and I realized over time that I'm most suited to legislative and policy work. And you should know there are a lot of options for you, but they depend a lot on what you like and what your proclivities are. So I, for example, realized after working on a death penalty case early on in my career that I would become too emotionally involved and maybe not take care of myself as well as I should if I wanted to stay strong for my clients. So I decided that might not be my focus because I couldn't sort of do that separation. A lot of people I know can. And there's also impact litigation where you're trying to change, and I worked on an impact litigation matter. The thing about that is they take very many years before you ever get to the merits, if you get to the merits, because litigation takes a long time, especially civil litigation. And so I felt like for me, it was going to frustrate my need for sort of instant gratification, or at least more instant than many years. So there's a pacing issue to think about as well. Of how you can change. So those are some things that you should be aware of, that you should really think about your personality, and you can ask people who are doing things that you might be interested in. Hey, what does it look like on a day-to-day basis? And they can talk to you about it. And you can ask me more questions later as well. So anyway, in the decades since I was in high school, even as crime consistently fell over decades, America locked up so many more people for so much longer, excuse me, that we went from being relatively in line with other democracies and free societies to being the worst incarcerator in the world. And so the first 10 to 15 years of my law career were in a terribly harsh environment for these issues, where it was hard to get traction for any reforms. So I wanted to just share a couple of things I learned from back then about what worked, and sort of what I took away from it. So the first point is it's critical to talk across difference. And I think you guys know this because in modern times we know more about this. But as a young New Yorker in Texas, I had to learn to befriend people who were in different political places than I was, and with very different backgrounds. And that's kind of how you get things done when things are getting done in a, I'm not talking about Congress today because they don't talk to each other and they don't get things done. But when a deliberative legislative body is working, it's working because people are compromising and talking to each other. And that's also how societies work better, is when people are in communication rather than siloed. So second point, there are many levers of change and many ways to engage. You could do all the different things I mentioned before. You could do you could go into private practice, and you could still be a really impactful player in the space. For example, private lawyers who do pro bono work often are extremely impactful, and also strategic philanthropy is really important. I do hit up my big firm friends for donations every once in a while, and so there's a place for kind of everybody in the spectrum. But you don't have to dedicate all your days to these issues to still be important. And I'll say an anecdote about that because it's really important, not just for like who you work with, but like how you get things done. Because unusual suspects, when you bring them into a space where they're not expected, can make a huge impact. So private bar, if you bring, somebody from the tax bar or an aviation lawyer to talk about criminal justice, people say, wow, why do other people care about this? It must be a really important issue. In particular, we were working on a bill to ban execution for persons with developmental disabilities. And our best ace in the hole for this was this extremely conservative guy who would never have shown up for an issue like this, except that he had a son who had developmental disabilities, and he understood how that could really impact people. And so he was the guy who testified at all the hearings, and people in that legislative body really listened to him because he was a guy who, went to church with the governor and was really close with all the big political top people. And would normally not have shown up for this kind of issues. That's a really important aspect, is to bring in unusual suspects and different people, and count on people's personal interests. One more thing, there's no boring issues. Don't limit yourself, because I used to tell myself, when I moved to Texas, I said, I'm not going to look at oil and gas law. I would never do that. That's so uninteresting to me, and tax law. And then when I worked at a firm, I got matters that were in oil and gas and in tax, and they were some of the most interesting things I've worked on in my career. When you get close and proximate to any issue, it's really, really, really interesting. So let yourself, geek out on something you didn't think you might be interested in. It might surprise you. Sometimes a complex issue that arises is whether to work to improve a broken system or start fresh. And this is seen in justice work, in the split between people working to take down the current system and those trying to make improvements, working within the system and with the stakeholders that are already working in the system to produce change. There is, I think, again, room for everyone. In early days of advocacy, we would often ask for critical hearings where we knew that certain voices would be seen as bomb throwing or sort of lightning rods, and we would say, hey, maybe don't put a card in on this hearing because it'll help pass the bill if you don't. So sometimes that's the right answer, and everyone has their own place in the sort of the landscape. So back then there was no constituency for this issue. That may be the biggest change ever. So there was no sense of including directly impacted individuals in any conversations. There was nothing about us without us. And people who have been incarcerated now can reach out to each other, can organize, can compare notes, can help make change together. That's a huge, huge change. Back then, 20, 30 years ago in this field, you couldn't say there are people who are affected by this because you didn't know, it was just impossible to quantify and bring people together. So, and I'm really proud to say my own organization has a directly impacted leader. And so governments and organizations have done a lot better at bringing different voices into the conversation, including those important voices. So last, I'm just going to close with saying, I know a lot of you may be disillusioned by the terrible behavior of so many adults and leaders and the terrible mess that we've left you, the climate, COVID, gun violence epidemic, and everything else that sucked for your generation. That gives you one advantage over us, though. You understand that just because civil rights happened, it's not perfect. There was a hope, maybe a belief, I think, back in our time, that we could rest and our rights were just protected. They would stay one. But that isn't true. I learned this after the civil rights movement. We weren't post-racial. We're not post-racial now. And I learned this after passing criminal legal reforms in Texas and then realizing how closely you have to watchdog things and hold the government's feet to the fire and make sure that things are happening or they don't happen. So that's another area of work that's really exciting, implementation and watchdogging work. So I would also recommend that. Bottom line is this: the good ideas for how to fix the messes that we are in as a country and a world are going to come from you, not from me, not from Jamie, not from any of us people, but we can give you maybe some guidance and share our experiences to help inform your work going forward. And I hope that you'll ask some questions and that this, I hope, will be some value to you as you go into your careers. Thank you. I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much for that, Hannah. And now I'll pass it on to Jamie. So just a short introduction, I kind of flew through those earlier, but Dr. Jamie Fader is an associate professor at Temple University. She's an advisor on JP's board and has helped us immensely in the past, and her work is extremely interesting. So I'll let you go into it, talk about your perspective, but thank you both for joining again.
All right. Well, thank you for the invitation, and thanks to everybody for tuning in today on a Saturday. I'm just going to start really with kind of a story of kind of how I got where I am. And I think there are a couple lessons that I'd like you to draw from that I think that's related to the topic of youth activists and activism. So I'm a professor of criminal justice. And in that role, I wear a lot of hats. I'm trained as a sociologist. I'm a researcher, I'm a book author, I'm a mentor, I'm an advisor, and I'm a leader in my department. So I play a role in making decisions about how we can go forward in the most just ways possible. When I started college in 1990, so long ago. I just I didn't know what I wanted to do with all of my energy. I was very interested in helping people in some way, and I just didn't know how that was. And in high school, I'd been really turned on by my political science classes, so I thought maybe I might go into kind of international relations and maybe need to go to law school before I did that. And so I took a lot of different classes and actually probably declared 3 majors before I found sociology. And sociology, just as soon as I sat down in that class, it was just speaking to me. And for those of you who haven't had any exposure to sociology, it's really kind of like the study of behavior based on the kind of groups that you belong to. So whereas psychology is kind of focused on the mind and the self, sociology is focused on society. And my wonderful professor was also a criminologist. So I got really kind of turned on in that space. There was a lot going on on campus at the time that I can talk about that was a good kind of training ground for activism. But I'm going to zoom ahead just a little bit and talk about kind of my first foray into, well, kind of my pathway, I guess, into the particular position that I'm in. So when I finished my master's degree, I spent a little over a year working at a nonprofit agency doing community health education. And that was something that I had learned about while I was at the University of Florida. And then I moved to Philly and took a research role for this very cool project. It was a massive program evaluation that basically followed every single kid in Philadelphia after they were adjudicated delinquent by the family court and sent to some kind of services, community-based or residential. And when I was hired on this research project to evaluate all these programs, I didn't know anything at all about juvenile justice. But what Hanna was describing, so we're up to 1997 now, what Hanna was describing about this kind of era of the super predator scare and get tough on crime was really kind of reaching its peak just as I started this work. And we were sending a lot of kids out of their homes to reform schools to really kind of retrain them and in a way to kind of civilize them. This is a very colonial framework. I hope that you're kind of hearing that. And so I played many roles on that project. But as we were collecting data over a course of 10 years, I realized that, I was analyzing a data set of 40,000 cases, but I had gone 6 years without ever talking with a young person who was in the system. And that seemed like a glaring omission. So when I started a PhD program, I knew exactly what I wanted to do for my dissertation. I wanted to really unpack the experience of young people who are taken from communities, the most impoverished communities in Philadelphia, for example, and removed from their homes and their communities and their families out to a placement facility, which is, a reform school or a training school. And they stay there for 9 months, 12 months, 15 months, or even longer, with the idea that they'll get therapy and they'll learn how to be not delinquent anymore. So I kind of used the relationships with the programs that I'd built as an evaluator and recruited young people to be part of my dissertation research. And I was learning at the time from one of the best teachers in the field how to do ethnography, which is essentially it's the systematic study of culture. It's kind of like anthropology, but it's more urban and local in focus. And so what it means is basically you spend a lot of time with the people who you study. And so I had 15 young men, boys on the cusp of becoming young men who were incarcerated when I met them. And then I got to know them while they were locked up, and then I followed them back to Philadelphia as they kind of resumed their lives after being incarcerated, and just kind of documented their transition back to the community and their transition to adulthood. And what this taught me that's related to activism is that we so seldom in social research actually talk to human beings, which is pretty weird. And it's actually pretty hard research to do. There are a lot of barriers to getting it published. There are a lot of barriers to getting sufficient credit for the amount of time investment that it takes to do that kind of research. And I think a lot of people a lot of researchers look at young people and think that they can't possibly articulate what's going on in a system in a sophisticated way, and that's just wrong. what I learned from the young people I followed. I mean, they taught me everything. They taught me what was going on in street culture in Philadelphia. They taught me all the language. And they taught me about what it's like to be taken away from your home and labeled as a criminal, and then to have to kind of try to restart your life after that. So I think that, I mean, I can talk a lot more about different roles that I've played in different places, but I think what holds all of this together really is my desire to be a translator. And I think in a way, this is kind of an activist position, because there are so many different kind of pockets of change makers. They don't often talk to one another. And so if I can translate research to people who are making policy, or if I can help make policy more understandable to students who are going to be, the next generation's practitioners, right? That's, in my view, kind of an activist position. So I'm going to stop there. I don't have, I mean, I wrote down some kind of things I wanted to get across during this talk, but I hope they'll kind of come out a little bit more organically as we continue to talk. And we're really hoping to get folks in the room to ask some questions too.
Yeah, so as a starter, just springboarding off of your own introductions of yourselves, can you kind of talk about, both of you have somewhat untraditional paths, like Jamie, you're from a sociology background. Hannah, you talked about journalism, then being a lawyer, all these different things. Can you guys discuss more about what it's like to go through those paths and know that maybe you won't end up in this one space or the goal that you set out with, but knowing that you're still moving forward towards something?
Anna, do you want to go first?
Sure. Okay. I mean, the one thing I would say is don't get caught in any traps where you think that your story has to make sense, your trajectory has to make sense, there can't be vectors. Like, I'm the weirdest. People do not understand my resume when they look at it. Like, I moved around because I have a family and I'm a woman, and I happen to go live in places with my now husband. So I had to reestablish myself professionally several times in different cities. That ended up being to my advantage because now I've worked in several states and have worked at the federal level, and that makes me more valuable in certain ways that I wouldn't have expected or known back then. So I would just sort of say, as long as you're engaged and doing something really interesting, it's going to eventually make sense. And don't like try to, like game it. Like, I'm going to study this so that I'll get hired to do this. Throw all that stuff out the window. Just do what's interesting, do what happens. Some things are going to come organically. Some things are going to, there's a period of time in my career I didn't apply for any jobs because I just kind of moved around and did different things with people. I was, it's much more mushy than you think. And when you tell someone's professional story at the end of it, it's kind of like if you go on a trip, you cannot, even if you have an itinerary, you don't know what's going to happen. So you can't actually write up what the final itinerary was until after the trip, right? So it's the same thing with your career. So don't try to do the right thing at the right time. Just do anything and just work hard and care. That's, I would say.
Yeah, I'm in agreement with that. I certainly had no idea early in my life where I was going to end up. I didn't aspire to be a professor. Didn't really know what I aspired to be, but and the moves that I made now in retrospect look like they were planned, but they weren't at all. So, when I was in college, I joined a group of peer educators. And I was leading a group called the AIDS Peer Educators, because AIDS at the time, if you got AIDS, it was a death sentence, and it was handled very poorly by our federal government, just like COVID, weirdly. And people were scapegoated, just like COVID. And we had this idea that like kind of only certain kind of people who were engaged in, immoral or sneaky behavior. Those were the people who got AIDS. And so there was a lot of misinformation around. There was a lot of stigma for the people who were living with that disease. And so as an educator, I just was doing like what was important to me. I really cared about that issue, and I wanted to get good information out to my peers. That ended up translating into a full-time job at a nonprofit, working as a community health educator, doing the very same thing. And then that job ended up qualifying me for my research job because I had research skills that I'd learned in graduate school, and I had worked for a nonprofit. So they hired me as a policy analyst to translate research to policymakers and to program people. And so all of that sounds like it was a straight line, but it wasn't at all. I had no idea how things were going to unfold. And I guess what I'll just say is I see a lot of my students who are very anxious about choosing the right path right away, or no, like they feel a lot of pressure, in particular to do jobs that their parents think are stable or lucrative. And unfortunately, that old roadmap is done. The kinds of jobs that are ahead of us, we haven't even heard of all of the titles yet. Like, I didn't know what a policy analyst was when I became a policy analyst. So please don't feel like panicked that you have to pick something right away, or else your whole life course is going to be off, time or off direction. That's just not the way it works. And I agree with Hannah that if you just keep doing what you care about, you'll end up looking back and thinking, oh, that looked like a more sensible path than when I was actually going through it.
I'll say one more thing, which is just again, don't limit yourself, and be bold. I mean, I will say, like, I got my first professional writing job I got because I was talking to someone on a bus. Another time just things just happen sort of organically. I was in an elevator with someone, and he worked in another magazine in another part of the building. And I asked him, oh, what's your magazine? And he said, oh, here's a copy and check it out. I went down, I read it up my desk. We didn't have email back then, sorry. I called him or something and said, hey, you need a copy editor. And I ended up working for that magazine for 6 or 7 years. It was a quarterly on the side, like it was a side gig for me, and I became the managing editor. Like, you never know what conversation is going to turn into. Be prepared to go out for a donut and end up living in another country, and you're good.
I think those are some pretty valuable pieces of advice. And like a little anecdote for me, the other day I went to get my car serviced, and I happened to sit next to a person who worked in the foreign services, and now I've been encouraged to apply for the foreign services. So I couldn't agree more that the most random connections happen at the most random times. So I want to emphasize that to everyone as well. We also got a question in chat, which is a little bit of a different vein, but I think still important, in terms of like getting these opportunities or just working towards your goals or anything like that. What are some of your guys' favorite books, podcasts, and educational resources? And this is from Gia.
Do you want to go first, since you're an educator and you probably have more answers? And I'll let people look at my bookshelf behind me, which has a few criminal legal reform books, and related books, some great ones. But go ahead.
I can start. Right now I'm reading a book called Becoming Abolitionists, which is pretty inspiring. My students have really pushed me to consider the abolitionist framework. And 5 years ago, I think I was so pragmatic. I just didn't think that abolition was a reasonable framework. It didn't make any sense to me. And for those of you who don't know abolitionism, it's the idea that we could meet our needs we could solve a lot of social problems like crime by taking care of one another, by taking care of basic needs, right? So the idea is we might not even need a criminal legal system, and we certainly might not need prisons, and we certainly might not need police at all if we just had a more robust social safety net, and we just had ways of solving our own problems. So for a long time, that seemed really pie in the sky to me. And my students really kept pushing me. And so I've been reading a lot more, and it's really turned my head around. Yeah, that's exactly right.
Well, I'm
Derek
excited to read that book now.
Yeah, it's a great book. The New Jim Crow was another like real turning point for a lot of people in this field. And in that book, Michelle Alexander shows how mass incarceration is an extension of slavery and how both systems operate on the same principles. As far as podcasts, my favorite podcast is This American Life by NPR. I absolutely love the storytelling. And I like Ear Hustle, which is a podcast done by people who are incarcerated, talking about their lives on the inside. So that's just a smattering.
I will add one little anecdote about Michelle Alexander, and that book was really important in the history of criminal legal reform because I would sort of say, and this is the Black community, some other communities that were just not woken up about how connected the system of incarceration is with historical, legacy, slavery, and colonialism, and all of those things, and how it's all baked in. And so so she did a series of speeches at Black churches all over the country, and she really helped make the whole, especially the evangelical community, realize that it wasn't drugs that was really hurting everybody and that they should be upset about, but it was the criminalization and the taking away of their children and putting them in non-therapeutic spaces and all that other stuff that was the real problem. And I guess for me, I really saw that as the first time we were allowed to talk about race in the conversation about criminal justice. And that was a big turn. I don't listen to that many podcasts, but I love shows like The Moth and things like that. And I'm, as far as books, the ones she said, plus I would definitely say, if you're interested in restorative justice, Until We Reckon by Danielle Surratt is really great. There's so many other great books, but just, I would say, listen to the people who listen to podcasts and other current stuff.
We will send all of that information out to everyone who's here. But moving on to another question that I guess kind of goes back to the idea of youth activism. So kind of what are the main differences you see in how Gen Z is reacting towards social changes? I know we've kind of talked about it in the past, but how do you see it manifest?
Well, I've thought about this a lot. I mean, we've talked about all of the multiple overlapping crises that we are all experiencing right now in this country and in this world. And there's so many. And you add to that the timeout that we had with COVID, this like 2 years of lost time where we're not connecting with other people, not really going anywhere. I mean, like not making any progress in our lives and not going anywhere, literally. So I think this generation is uniquely situated to see what is happening. And what I'm seeing in my classrooms is that I don't have to set up the problems like I used to. They're like, yeah, we know problems. Can we talk more about solutions? So I've had to revamp my syllabi so that half of the class is focused on solutions. We're not just spending time talking about problems. So I find this, Gen Z to be very solutions focused, committed to being part of the solution to these problems, very worldly in a way that we weren't back in the day, because y'all are connected to people all over the world, and you can, you just see on TikTok or Instagram or wherever, you can connect with people in all parts of the world. So you have an understanding of like globalness that we just really didn't have as Gen Xers. And I'll leave Hanna to talk about inclusivity, because I think that's another major change that she and I have both seen.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I hadn't thought about this before, but I was just thinking about the tables that I've sat at over the years and how they've changed, right? Like, so back in 2001, when we were trying to pass a lot of legislation and we were bringing together all the stakeholders, right? Of course, back then, stakeholders did not include formerly incarcerated people or families of incarcerated people at all. That wasn't even on anyone's mind at all. But the rooms where we tried to bring people together, we were trying to sort of connect different communities that had a lot of similar oppressions happening, but weren't connected and hadn't been able to amalgamate. So we were bringing together the, faith groups and the direct service groups that were actually helping people with stuff, the people who were starting to figure out that, oh, wow, when people come out of incarceration, they don't have any resources and they usually fail because nobody helps them, just like we didn't help them before. I mean, that goes back to the care community. And like, I'll say one more thing. Actually, I'm going to circle back a tiny bit to that in terms of like idealism and an end goal of ending prisons, for me, has always been the end goal, but that doesn't make you not pragmatic. To understand that we want to live in a society, in my opinion, doesn't make you not pragmatic to say we want to live in a society where we can find other ways to hold people accountable, and we can hold each other accountable in ways that allow us to avoid sort of demonizing and separating people so much from the community. Instead, we can have shared values and work for shared safety. And that involves compromise, and it involves more people in the room. And we are seeing the people come into the room. The people are starting to be in the rooms, like I said earlier, and so I think that's only going to help make coming to solutions for diverse communities much easier. But you guys have to kind of crack the code of how to take it from tokenism and including someone just because you have to include someone to like really meaningful involvement. Like, I'm really proud, like I said, to have a directly impacted leader, but a lot of directly impacted leaders are not being given the executive director positions where they're making all the decisions in nonprofits. And so I'm proud to be part of one that is, but that's not the norm. Really, it isn't. Sometimes people feel just as tokenized, when they're included today. So we have to figure out how to include people more meaningfully, and how to have a whole society that understands that caring for each other in some way is the only way forward to getting to anything better, let alone our end point that's idealistic. So I will leave it there.
I'll just say one more quick thing. I feel like we're running out of time, but I wanted to offer just a couple specific examples of what's happening in justice spaces now that's different and so exciting. This idea of nothing about us without us has really taken root. And I can see that. So many of you might know that Pennsylvania had the most young people serving life without parole sentences that they were given before they were adults, right, as juveniles. So we call that JLWOP, juvenile life without parole. We had more than anyone in the world, actually. And Philly was the epicenter of that. So in the last 10 years, the Supreme Court has made a couple rulings that have allowed those folks to have a second chance. And many of them have been released after spending 30, 40 years in prison, are now coming back to Philadelphia. And they have formed a supportive community for each other. And they share resources, they hold each other up. And each of them has done something remarkable. They've started their own nonprofit, or they've joined existing nonprofits. They've set up speakers bureaus, and we bring them into our classrooms at Temple University and other universities to talk about their experiences. And many of them have become credible messengers. So this idea of a credible messenger has really taken off. This idea of somebody who has been impacted by the system, who is in a really unique position to understand that system from personal experience. And these people, if we have to have probation officers, these people should be our probation officers. These people should be our mentors. These people should be our violence interrupters. They have really important roles to play, and we're starting to see that take off. Hanna is absolutely right that we need to keep monitoring pay and equity for these positions.
I think that's a really important point that you both bring up towards the end in terms of, I think this is something more that Hanna brought up, but less tokenism and more so meaningful activism and meaningful change. I think that's something that at least we're trying to do at JP, and I hope it's something that's incorporated in a lot more mainstream ways than sort of a side part of society where it's almost like there's this sphere where we focus on changing for the better and all of that, and then there's mainstream society. I hope they kind of more integrate, which is, I think, the themes that you're both touching on. But we are sort of wrapping up towards the end of our session. Unfortunately, we will have to wrap up soon. So last chance for any questions in the chat, please do send them in. But I do want to end off with a question for both of you. How can we stay in touch with you? How can we stay involved and see both of y'all's work?
Gosh, we can't hear you, Hanna.
All right. For me, any of you, I would be happy to talk to anybody about any worries they have, ideas they have, thoughts they have. I mean, I'm always happy to talk to young people, especially, but if you talk to me, I will, if you're interested in law school, I will not dissuade you. So be careful, because I am known to convince people to go to law school when they're not sure. So decide if you want to talk to me. I think law school is more fun than humans should be allowed to have, but it's only if you know that it's a real break. It's a real, grad school can be a real break if you've worked. If you go straight to grad school, I don't know if you as much appreciate how much of a luxury it is, and it's for you. It's all for you. Nobody's in charge of you. So anyway, you can see my work either at the Center for Justice and Human Dignity's website, which is cjhd.org, or I do publish sometimes, personal opinion pieces and things like that. So keep an eye out for me. And that's it. You'll probably see more publications from me in the future. Jamie?
Similar to Hanna, please reach out to me. I just put my email address in the chat. So if you want to talk careers or pathways, I'm happy to talk about that. If you're interested in an academic career, I know all about that, and also work in kind of like the research and policy kind of intersection area. So please feel free to reach out and look for my next book, which will be out December 12th.
Yay.
It's called On Shifting Ground, Constructing Manhood on the Margins.
Oh, I can't wait. That sounds amazing.
Thanks.
Thank you all so much for being
Thanks,
here.
everybody.
Thank you.